Windows 10 might be recording and uploading your PC's activity history without you knowing. The IRS dropped the ball on their recent Linux migration according to a recent audit by Treasury Inspector General. A comparison of 12 of the more popular Linux desktop environments, including LXDE, Pantheon and Trinity. Do you want Adobe's Premiere Pro ported over to Linux? Let your voice be heard, assuming anybody at Adobe wants to listen. MS Linux. Could Microsoft release a desktop Linux distro? It's not as far-fetched as you think. These are 5 stories that I will be taking into account. So, the first story on the docket tonight. Yet another Microsoft Windows privacy story. I hate to keep beating a dead horse, but Microsoft, they just keep dropping the ball here. I mean, they just keep messing up in huge ways. So, there is a story over on Tech Radar. Windows 10 might be recording and uploading your PC's activity history without you knowing. What Windows 10 is doing is they are sending your PC's activity history to the cloud. They're putting it online without your permission. So reading, by the way, this article from Tech Radar was written by Darren Allen. As always, I will link to all the articles I discuss on today's show in this show's description. Reading the first paragraph here. Microsoft is in fresh hot water on the privacy front with the apparent revelation that the data Windows 10 collects on what you've been doing on your PC is stored in the cloud, even if you've told the operating system not to upload it. So whether you give Windows permission to upload this stuff or not, it's still uploading it to the cloud. This issue was flagged by a Reddit user. A Reddit user discovered this. It was also spotted by How To Geek, a popular website, and it's quite easy to check all this for yourself on your Windows 10 PC. So if you got a Windows 10 machine, you go to Settings, and under Settings, you have Privacy. Click on the Activity History in that left-hand sidebar. You see what the activity history records. What applications you've been accessing on your machine, what documents, what files you've opened. Probably includes some stuff about web history and things like that. And assuming you allow Windows to collect all that information on these activities, you ticked a checkbox, right? You gave it permission to collect all that information. Well, there's also a box that allows Windows to sync all that information it collects to the cloud. They have some sort of cloud service that they can send all this to. But apparently, whether you check that box on or off, it doesn't matter. Windows is still sending that information to the cloud. They are putting your private information without your permission online. Think about that for a second. Reading a little further in the article here, and I quote, "Even worse, if you click the Clear Activity History button on Windows 10, so there's a button that says Clear Activity History, so clear all your history. It should just make it go away, delete all that data. It will do that on your machine, but all that information will remain present on your online privacy dashboard in the cloud. So once they, without your permission, send your data to the cloud, there's no way really for you to delete it, not from your Windows machine. You can clear your activity history, get rid of everything on your physical machine at home. That information is still on the cloud. Reading a little further here, apparently there's still a lot of confusion about what's going on. There's been some speculation that maybe this is happening to folks because they have their Windows 10 diagnostic data set to full. So that's another privacy related option that you find under Settings, Privacy, Diagnostic. They're really not exactly sure what is causing this, but this is an issue that Microsoft has to address and address quickly. Also, they need to get rid of all that information on the cloud that was sent there without people's permission. I mean, this is a huge story, right? This is gigantic. This is a privacy nightmare for those of you that are still running Windows 10. I say it all the time. You guys running proprietary operating systems like Windows and Mac, if you value your privacy, your security, your freedom, you got to come over to open source. You really should take a good hard look at Linux. It's not as scary as you think. And the second story on the docket tonight is about the IRS migrating over to Linux. This story comes from FCW, and it talks about IRS. They have botched their Linux migration. This article was written by Derek Johnson. Reading the first paragraph here of the article. Poor IT governance prevented the IRS from making progress on a long-term effort to migrate 141 legacy applications from proprietary vendor software to open-source Linux operating systems, according to an audit by the Treasury Inspector General for Tax Administration. So, the Treasury Inspector General did an audit of this IRS migration. They're moving 141 legacy applications from proprietary software, a proprietary operating system, in this case Solaris, which Solaris is a proprietary operating system originally created by Sun Microsystems. It is now owned by Oracle. They're moving from Solaris and they're moving over to free and open source operating systems like Linux. In particular, they're going to use IBM Z Linux, very popular on mainframes. Anyway, under the migration plan that was developed back in 2014, of the 141 legacy applications that were targeted to make this transition, only 8 have made the transition. More than a third of those 141 applications, work has not even begun on making the transition over to Linux. So this audit basically points a lot of fingers at why this hasn't been done in a timely fashion, what is taking so long for the transition from Solaris over to Linux. It seems part of the problem is the IRS is a gigantic organization, right? The IRS, the Internal Revenue Service here in the U.S., they collect all our income taxes, is a massive government agency. And quoting the article here, prior to implementation, the IRS did not develop an initial project plan or conduct upfront assessments and technical analysis on the applications and databases that were to be migrated. Basically, they just didn't have a plan in place. They just didn't do enough of the upfront work before all of this got started. This has led to a lot of delays and mainly a lot of confusion about what is going on as far as this transition. So why was the IRS planning on moving from Solaris over to Linux? Well, again, proprietary software, free and open source software. They want to move to a free operating system, and in this case, the IRS wants to move to a free operating system as in free beer. They're not necessarily caring about the freedom aspect of free software, but they want the free as in cost aspect. A internal cost assessment found that migrating just one system over at the IRS, in this case a modernized e-file system, the article talks about, would save the agency $12 million over 5 years in licensing fees alone. So that's just one system. They want to migrate, of course, 141 legacy applications over to Linux. The auditors made some recommendations on how the IRS could fix some of the delays here. The big one is basically they need to assign the project to a governance board, basically have somebody in charge running the show here. The IRS is expected to complete this migration from Solaris over to Linux by fiscal year 2020. And the third story on the docket tonight is a comparison of 12 of the more popular Linux desktop environments. This article comes from linuxlinks.com. It was written by Steve Ems. Anyway, this is actually an updated article. Apparently, they did an article earlier about 9 Linux desktop environments. They compared them as far as features, user experience, extensibility, etc., system resource usage. So they did an article previously where they surveyed 9 Linux desktop environments, and they left a few out. You know, people requested, hey, you should have included Pantheon, Trinity, LXDE in your survey. So they did it again, this time with 12 desktop environments they cover. The 12 are KDE Plasma, Pantheon, GNOME, XFCE, Mate, the Deepin desktop environment, Cinnamon, Budgie, LXDE, Enlightenment, Trinity, and LXQt. So the very first thing they compare these 12 desktop environments on is features. I think everybody can agree that KDE Plasma is easily the most feature-rich desktop environment available on Linux, by far. You can do anything imaginable with KDE Plasma. There are a million settings in that thing. The settings are all over the place, though. It's one of the reasons I don't like recommending Plasma to new to Linux users, is because the desktop environment, even though you can do a lot with it, is very confusing. Just finding some of the settings on Plasma can be very confusing to a brand new user. But they found that the second most feature-rich desktop environments, tied, were Pantheon and GNOME. GNOME I kind of see. Pantheon is not a very feature-rich desktop environment, in my opinion. I don't know how they determined that. Reading a little bit from the article here. Pantheon applications are designed and developed by Elementary. Elementary OS develops Pantheon. Anyway, what the article here discusses that they liked about Pantheon was they liked the wing panel, the top panel that's similar to the GNOME shell. They liked files, which is the file manager. That's the GNOME file manager. I'm not sure why they think that's a Pantheon thing. Anyway, they like the email client in Pantheon. That's great. What does that have to do with the desktop environment itself? I can install that email client on any of the other 11 desktop environments in this survey. I'm not really sure where the author got off saying that Pantheon is so feature-rich. I don't see that. Anyway, trailing Pantheon and GNOME were XFCE, which I think is much, much more feature-rich than Pantheon. By far. Mate, also much more feature-rich than Pantheon. Deepin is kind of a new desktop environment. It's still kind of beta software. Not a lot of features to it. Cinnamon's pretty feature-rich. Budgie's still kind of under development. Trailing behind LXDE, Enlightenment, Trinity, and LXQt. The next thing they compare is user experience. So they compare the same 12 desktop environments as far as user experience. Wow. Somebody is definitely a KDE Plasma fanboy because the best user experience is Plasma. Okay. The Deepin desktop environment is also number one alongside Plasma. You know what? I could see that. The Deepin desktop environment is actually pretty good. The workflow in Deepin is a fantastic desktop environment. I just wish it was a little lighter on system resources, but I could see Deepin being at the top of this. Below Deepin, GNOME, XFCE, Pantheon, Mate, and it seems last place again in his survey. Apparently he doesn't like the lightweight desktop environments, and they're my favorite. So this concerns me that he ranks LXDE, Enlightenment, Trinity, and LXQt at the bottom. Again, he ranked them at the bottom of features. He ranks them at the bottom of user experience. I would rank them near the top, actually, if this was my list, but oh well. This is his article. Memory consumption. Now, this is where those lightweight desktop environments that I like really shine. Number one, Enlightenment. Enlightenment is blazing fast. Enlightenment is incredibly lightweight. You could run a machine with, 256 megs of RAM, and Enlightenment would be fine on that machine. That's how lightweight Enlightenment is. LXDE, incredibly lightweight. Mate, he ranks Mate ahead of LXQt as far as memory consumption. Another thing is, what distros are you using? If you didn't install these on a system like Arch, which just gives you the bare bones desktop environment as the creators of those desktop environments intended, then you're probably getting some skewed numbers, because there's no way Mate is lighter on RAM usage than LXQt. This is strange. Deepin desktop environment is also ranking very high in the list, and that is strange. It should rank at the bottom. I mean, Deepin uses a ton of memory. Of course, GNOME is famous for using a ton of memory as well. Although neither Deepin or GNOME are at the bottom, Cinnamon is at the bottom here. Yeah, I'm not exactly sure, again, what distros he tested these on. I guess I should have read the article a little closer. I'm not sure if he actually mentions the distro he tested these on. Anyway, memory consumption using popular software. So he tested things like Terminator, FileZilla, Enlightenment, Dolphin, LibreOffice Calc, LXDE, RStudio, Trinity Desktop, Pantheon, and of course Firefox. Firefox, being a web browser, is going to use the most memory. Let's move on to extensibility. Let's see how he ranks these 12 Linux desktop environments as far as how extensible they are. I have a feeling that Plasma and GNOME are going to be very high in the list, and appropriately they are. You can do whatever you want to do with Plasma, you can do it. You can make Plasma to look and feel and mimic any operating system known to man, practically. GNOME is also very extensible due to the extensions that you add to GNOME, but the problem with GNOME is you almost have to add extensions to GNOME to make it usable. GNOME, vanilla GNOME, is actually a pretty bad desktop environment. Also ranking pretty good in the extensibility rankings were XFCE, Mate, Enlightenment, Cinnamon, Budgie, and then of course ranking last are a lot of the lightweight desktops. LXQt, Deepin, it's not a lightweight desktop, but again, it's a fairly new desktop environment. Trinity, Pantheon, and LXDE rounding out the bottom of the list. Documentation and support is the next category he ranks. GNOME, apparently. The GNOME documentation, I'm not that familiar with GNOME as far as their documentation and support, but apparently the author is impressed with them. Mate, I know Mate has exceptional documentation, so it makes sense that it's ranked highly on this list. And Plasma is third, with the rest of them near the bottom. Anyway, the last part of the survey is not a survey at all. It's just some final thoughts on these desktop environments. He mentions, of course, the fact that Enlightenment is so blazing fast, but it's not the kind of desktop environment most people will want to run. If you want a light desktop environment that's still kind of full-featured and kind of looks and feels like a traditional workflow, like a Windows 98 kind of workflow, LXDE is a great option. Trinity is actually pretty dang good too. I highly recommend the Trinity desktop environment for those wanting a full desktop environment that has all the features you want, but still blazing fast, very lightweight. Anyway, I thought this was an interesting little survey. I don't agree with a lot of how he ranked these things in their various categories, but again, I'm not exactly sure what distro he was using. It didn't say anywhere in the article that I could find what distro he tested these things on, because these desktop environments, of course, look very differently depending on the distro you install them on, because each particular distro does a different GNOME desktop environment. For example, Fedora does a pretty vanilla GNOME. Arch does nothing but vanilla GNOME. Manjaro really customizes GNOME. Ubuntu customizes GNOME crazy into, this Unity clone. So it really depends on what Linux distro you're basing these things on, especially when you get into things like RAM and CPU usage. And the fourth story on the docket tonight: do you want Adobe's Premiere Pro and the other Adobe suite of products like Photoshop? Do you want those ported over to Linux? If you do, here's your chance to let your voice be heard, assuming that the folks at Adobe plan to listen to you at all. This article comes from Forbes. This article is written by Jason Evangelo, who's been writing a lot of really good Linux articles over at Forbes.com. You guys really should check out his writing. I feature a lot of his articles on the Taking Into Account series. He is a recent Linux convert, so it's good because being a new to Linux user, Jason really has a different perspective on things than somebody like me that's been using Linux forever. So his articles are really refreshing to read. Anyway, reading a little bit of this article: want Adobe's Premiere Pro ported to Linux? Here's what to do is the title of the article. Recently, Jason, he polled more than 1,600 Mac and Windows users over on Twitter, asking them, hey, what's the reason, what's holding you back from making the switch to Linux? And the number one reason why most people have not moved from Windows, especially over to Linux for years, it's been gaming. But thanks to Steam and Proton, we've almost got that one figured out, right? Gaming on Linux is getting almost as good as Windows, right? If you're a professional gamer, if you're a serious hardcore gamer, competitive gamer, then you're probably still using Windows. But for casual gamers, gaming on Linux is just fine. So now, what is holding most people back? Jason mentions a lot of people were telling him that the Adobe apps, Premiere Pro and Photoshop, were what people were really complaining about, that the fact that the Adobe suite was not available on Linux, and I can echo that. I get that all the time. The most common apps that are not gaming related that people tell me keeps them on Windows or Mac: Microsoft Office and the Adobe suite. That's what is holding up so many people back from the switch to Linux. So, reading further down the article here. So, a Phoronix reader recently spotted a tweet from the Adobe customer care site. Anyway, it was in response to a question that was posted over on that site about developing a Linux port of Premiere Pro. And the response from Adobe customer care in this tweet was, "Hi, thanks for your message. Engineering has limited resources and there's not a big enough demand for a Linux version of Premiere quite yet, I'm afraid. That's not to say it will always be that way. Please upvote that feature request here." And there is a feature request over at adobe-video.uservoice.com. I'm going to link to this feature request here. And the Adobe guys basically said, yeah, if you want this, support it, over here at this feature request, upvote this. And it has got nearly 6,000 upvotes for this feature request, which is for Premiere Pro to have a Linux port. Almost 6,000 upvotes. And there are 1,537 comments to this feature request, most of them simply saying, we need Linux support, please give us the Adobe software in Linux, yada, yada, yada. So Adobe, they're not saying they're ever going to make a Linux port. They've never seemed interested in supporting Linux, but there is that feature request, and they said, hey, if you guys are interested, let us know. Now, there was a little bit of a controversy about this feature request. This page disappeared for a couple of days. And there was some backlash from the Linux community saying, apparently you don't even want to listen to us. You just deleted the feature request. You didn't give us a reason why you deleted the feature request. At the time they deleted it, it had more than 3,000 upvotes. It was by far the most popular feature request over on the site. And Adobe quickly responded saying, hey, this wasn't anything we intentionally did. This feature request was so popular, so many of you guys were voting and commenting that it triggered our spam filters, and that's why the feature request was taken down. But the page is back up. As of today, the page is back up, and if you guys are interested in Premiere Pro being ported over to Linux or Adobe Photoshop or anything like that, find this page. Of course, I'm going to link to it in the show description. Go ahead, give it an upvote, leave a comment, let Adobe know that we want some of their Creative Suite apps ported over to Linux. And the fifth and final story on the docket tonight is MS Linux. Could Microsoft release a desktop Linux distribution? Sounds crazy, right? Well, I don't think it's far-fetched. Not as far-fetched as some people make it sound. So this article comes from ZDNet. This article was written by Stephen J. Von Nichols. Could Microsoft release desktop Linux? Yes, they could. And I would no longer bet they won't. Here's why. So Stephen J. Von Nichols says not only could they, he thinks that they likely will. So reading the first sentence of this article. I used to say that Microsoft would release a Microsoft desktop Linux, maybe called MS Linux or Lindows, when pigs fly. Lately, though, I've been hearing oinking from the sky. So Stephen J. Von Nichols says Microsoft desktop Linux distribution is likely. He jokingly says it will be called MS Linux or Lindows. It can't be called Lindows, though, Stephen J. Von Nichols. There's already a Linux distribution by that name. Makulu has an edition called Lindows, so Microsoft can't grab that one. But MS Linux, that's a fine choice. So does any of this really make any sense? Why would Microsoft release a desktop Linux distribution of their own? Well, Microsoft has embraced Linux and open source fully, really. I mean, they are members of the OIN, the Open Invention Network. They always talk about how much they love Linux. They love Git. They bought GitHub. Their Azure platform, the #1 operating system on Azure, Linux, not Windows. Of course, you've got the Windows subsystem for Linux. So Microsoft is already doing a lot in the Linux and open source space. Also, recently, Microsoft announced that they are dumping their own web browser, their proprietary web browser called Edge. They're dumping that and moving to Google's open source Chromium browser code. They'll create their own browser based on the Chromium browser code, which is open source. And again, it was a Google project, which Google is a major rival of Microsoft. So that is interesting, moving from, again, a proprietary application of their own to an open source solution. Could they do that with the operating system? I think they could. Windows 10, you don't see too many positive stories about Windows 10 anymore. Just look back to the very first story on taking into account this evening. Not a positive story. The recent Windows 10 updates have not been good. There have been some disastrous update rollouts that have damaged people's machines. So eventually, Microsoft may want to look to an open source solution as far as an operating system to offer the public. Microsoft invests billions in developing Windows. They make money off of Windows, but they're making less and less money off of Windows now. Desktop operating systems like Windows, not as big a moneymaker as they were in years past. So it would not be a shock for Microsoft to decide that they would be better placed in investing that money elsewhere. And instead of spending all that money developing their own proprietary operating system, when there's perfectly good free and open source operating systems out there, Microsoft could just spin up their own Linux distribution, make that available to the public. It's not a crazy notion. You know, I haven't been drinking early today. It is a possibility. And that was the fifth and final story on this edition of Taking Into Account. This was Taking Into Account episode 20. I try to release a new episode of Taking Into Account every Thursday, so look for Taking Into Account episode 21 sometime next Thursday. Other than the 5 main stories that I cover on Taking Into Account, I always like to end these shows with a viewer question or comment, and this viewer question or comment actually comes over on YouTube. I recently did a video about Haiku. Haiku is an operating system that is based on the old B operating system from the 90s. And in that video, I mentioned that Haiku is a single user system, meaning you can't have multiple users. There's one user on that operating system. There's no root user. Your user has root privileges, so that you never have to invoke anything like sudo to do anything on the system. There's one user. That one user can do anything he wants to the system without having to do sudo or su or anything. Well, I got this comment from one of the viewers who corrected me a little bit on that. He says, not quite. There's a POSIX multi-user. You can do things like user add, change ownership, SU, switch user, SSH to other users. So some command line stuff you can do, multi-user. You just can't run the GUI as another user. So the graphical user interface is a single user system, but there is POSIX multi-user, so you can user add, SU, SSH, and all that. So a good comment there from Mr. Waddlesplash. I appreciate that, sir. And before I go, as always, I have to thank a few people. This show was made possible by Ansem, Carlos, Chris, David, Leor, Rob, and Tony. They are the producers of the show. They are my highest tiered patrons over on Patreon. The show was also brought to you by all those fine ladies and gentlemen. You see all their names on the screen. They are the supporters of this channel. If you enjoyed this video, please consider supporting the channel. You will find me at DistroTube over on Patreon. Peace, guys.